Right now, you might be 27, maybe 34, maybe older, and somewhere in the back of your head, quietly, you are still wondering when you are going to actually feel like a grown-up. Relax. Here's the strange news. For 99% of human history, at your exact age, you were not becoming an adult. You had already been one for half your life. By 13, an ancient human was a full working member of the group, hunting, building, carrying real weight. The long, soft, protected childhood you got, the one with school and snacks and figuring yourself out, is a brand new invention, barely 150 years old. So why did they grow up so fast, while we take what feels like forever? And here's the twist that science did not see coming. In one specific way, humans actually have the longest childhood of any animal on Earth. Both of those things are true at the same time. Let's go. Okay, first we have to take a wrecking ball to the myth that ruins this entire topic. You have heard it 100 times. Ancient people only lived to about 30. So obviously they had to rush, cram everything in, and grow up fast before the clock ran out. That statistic is technically true and almost completely misleading. Yes, average life expectancy in the ancient world was often in the 20s or 30s. But that average is dragged into the basement by one brutal fact. A huge share of children, in many groups something like a third to a half, did not survive past the age of 5. Illness, hunger, accidents, all of it stacked against the very young. Here is the part that changes everything. If you survived childhood, if you made it to 15, your life did not suddenly stop at 30. Your remaining years jumped way up. Plenty of ancient people reached their 50s, 60s, even 70s. Grandparents were not rare mythical creatures. They were around, they mattered, and we will get to why they might be one of the most important things our species ever produced. So, the cartoon version, everyone dropped at 30, so breed fast, is wrong. Ancient humans did not grow up fast because the finish line was close. They grew up fast for reasons that are much stranger and much more interesting. And the first one is this. For almost all of human history, the teenager did not exist. I do not mean people that age did not exist. Obviously they did. I mean the concept, the whole idea of a special protected life stage between child and adult was simply not a thing. The word teenager itself only entered common English in the 1940s. Read that again. The 1940s. The teenager is younger than the telephone. The idea got its first real academic push from a psychologist named Stanley Hall, who popularized the term adolescence back in 1904 as a distinct, stormy stage of development. Before that framing spread, you were basically one of two things: a small child who needed care, or a person who could start pulling their weight. There was no decade-long waiting room in between where you were expected to just, find yourself. Compare that to now. A researcher named Jeffrey Arnett coined a term in the year 2000 for the phase most of you are living in, or just crawled out of: emerging adulthood. The stretch from about 18 to 29 where you are biologically a full adult but socially still buffering, still trying on careers, cities, relationships, and identities like outfits. That entire life stage, the one you think is normal, is younger than some of your parents. An ancient 14-year-old would find your life baffling. You can legally drive a car, sign a lease, and go to war, and you are still asking your mother to book your dentist appointment. To them, you would look like an adult stuck in permanent training mode, running a childhood that refuses to end. Now let us talk about what those young, ancient humans were actually doing, because it is genuinely humbling. Children in foraging societies worked, and they worked early, not in a grim factory sense, but as real contributors. Anthropologists like Blurton Jones and Frank Marlowe, who spent years studying the Hadza foragers of Tanzania, documented something remarkable. Hadza kids start gathering their own food shockingly young. By the time they are in the range we would call late elementary school, many are collecting a serious chunk of their own daily calories, digging tubers, picking fruit, grabbing small prey. Think about that. Somewhere out there is a 9-year-old who can feed themselves off the land, while a lot of modern adults cannot assemble a salad without a tutorial. By their early teens, Ancient kids were often skilled hunters, tool makers, fire keepers, and childcare providers for younger siblings. The archaeological record backs this up. Skeletons of ancient adolescents sometimes show the muscle marks and wear of years of hard physical labor already logged before they hit 15. You might wonder how we even know the ages of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Teeth. Human teeth erupt and wear on a fairly predictable timetable, so a single jaw can reveal roughly how old its owner was with surprising accuracy. And when researchers line up ancient young skeletons, they keep finding the same story. Bodies that were still growing, but already stamped with adult-level labor, injury, and responsibility. The bones do not lie. These were kids doing grown-up work. The anthropologist Melvin Connor, who wrote a landmark book on the evolution of childhood, points out that even ancient play was really training in disguise. These kids did not have toys that beeped and charged overnight. They had miniature versions of the real thing. Little bows, small digging sticks, dolls of bundled hide. When a forager child chased a lizard or built a tiny shelter, they were not wasting time. They were running a low-stakes rehearsal of the exact skills that would keep them alive in 10 years. Your childhood had a tablet that helped raise you. Theirs had an entire landscape that quizzed them daily. The upshot is that ancient children were staggeringly independent by our standards. A modern 10-year-old often cannot be left home alone for an afternoon without a panicked phone call. An ancient 10-year-old might spend the whole day roaming, foraging, and solving problems miles from camp, then wander back with dinner. This is not because they were some tougher species. Their brains and bodies were the same as your kids. It is because the world expected it of them, and humans quietly rise or sink to whatever the world around them expects. Raise a person to be capable at 9, and usually they are. Raise them to be managed until 25, and, well, look around. So the picture is clear. Grow up fast, contribute fast, or the whole group feels it. And yet, and this is where it gets genuinely mind-bending, humans are also the slowest growing apes on the planet. Here is the paradox. Biologically, we take forever to mature. A chimpanzee is largely self-sufficient years before a human child is. The anthropologist Barry Bogan argues that humans actually evolved extra life stages that other apes do not have, a distinct childhood and a distinct adolescence, specifically to give our enormous, expensive brains enough time to wire up and learn. And there is a good reason for the long build. A scientist named Hillard Kaplan describes human survival as running on embodied capital, meaning skills, knowledge, and technique stored in the brain and body. Being a successful ancient human was hard. Tracking animals, knowing hundreds of plants, reading weather, making tools, navigating a web of social alliances. You cannot learn all that in a weekend. It takes a long, protected apprenticeship. So, evolution gave us a long childhood, specifically to become expert humans. And this was not learn it in an afternoon knowledge. Take stone tool making. Napping a sharp blade off a raw rock is genuinely hard. Modern archaeologists who study it spend years getting good, and the finest ancient tools took thousands of practiced strikes to master. Now stack tracking on top, where a smudge in the dirt tells you the animal, its size, how long ago it passed, and whether it was hurt. Now add a living map of hundreds of plants. Which ones feed you, which ones heal you, which ones harm you. An ancient teenager was carrying a working encyclopedia in their skull, assembled through years of hands-on apprenticeship that began before they could barely walk. And there was often a single moment that sealed the promotion. A young hunter's first real catch. The first time they hauled back meat that fed people other than themselves, landed like a graduation, a job offer, and a birthday all at once. No diploma, no stage, just a teenager walking into camp carrying proof that they could now keep other people fed. Sit with the weight of that at 13. The closest a lot of us get at that age is unlocking a new level or finally beating a hard boss. Their big win fed the whole family. Ours mostly fed a high score. Sit with the contradiction, because it is beautiful. Biology gave us the longest learning childhood of any animal. Then ancient culture said, "Great, now that you can walk and talk and throw a spear, congratulations, you are basically an adult." The slow-growing body met the fast-promoting society, and they collided right around age 12 to 15. And here's a fact that should make every anxious 24-year-old feel a little better. Your brain is not even done yet at that age. Neuroscientists, including a lot of work led by Jay Guide, have shown that the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, impulse control, and long-term judgment, keeps maturing into the mid-20s, roughly age 25. Let that land. Ancient societies were handing full adult responsibility to 13-year-olds whose brains had another decade of construction left. And before you feel too smug, so was yours when you rented that first apartment. We are all, to some degree, adults with brains that showed up to the job slightly unfinished. Our ancestors just did it younger and with much higher stakes. There is one more twist worth adding, because people assume ancient puberty always hit earlier. Often, it was the opposite. In many groups, the first signs of physical maturity arrived later than they do for well-fed kids today, sometimes at 15 or 16, because a body running on an uncertain food supply delays maturity on purpose. Growing and reproducing are wildly expensive in calories, so the body quietly waits until it senses enough energy to survive the gamble. So the ancient path was not really about bodies ripening faster than yours. It was about societies promoting people into adulthood the instant the body was ready, with none of the long buffer we now take for granted. And that half-built young brain was not purely a weakness either. A growing line of neuroscience argues the teenage brain is wired the way it is on purpose. The same circuitry that makes adolescents bolder, more drawn to risk, hungrier for status and novelty, is exactly what you would want in a young person who has to leave the safety of childhood, learn at breakneck speed, prove themselves, and step into a dangerous adult world without hesitating. In other words, the reckless streak we now try to manage out of modern teenagers may be an ancient feature, not a bug. It once helped a young human leap into adulthood and survive it. So your teenage era of deeply questionable decisions was, in a strange way, working exactly as designed. Now, how did a group survive relying on such young adults? This is where two of the most elegant ideas in anthropology come in. The first is weaning. Apes like chimps nurse their young for around 4 to 5 years, which naturally spaces out births. Humans figured out how to wean much earlier, often by 2 or 3, partly because the group could feed a small child soft foods and share the load. Earlier weaning meant mothers could have children closer together, more children, faster, in a dangerous world. But that only works if someone helps carry the weight, which brings us to the single most underrated character in human history, the grandmother. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes built an entire framework around this, the grandmother hypothesis. Human females are bizarre among mammals. They go through menopause and then keep living for decades. Almost no other animal does that. From a cold evolutionary view, once you cannot reproduce, why stick around? The proposed answer: because grandmothers were not done being useful. They gathered food, they carried and fed grandchildren, and they freed up younger mothers to have more babies sooner. A grandmother was a survival engine. This ties into what Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy calls cooperative breeding. In her work, she makes the case that human children were never raised by just 2 exhausted parents. They were raised by a whole network: grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated helpers. Anthropologists call these extra caregivers alloparents. The village raising the child is not a sweet saying. It is a literal survival strategy that let our species reproduce fast while keeping the young alive. So a 13-year-old stepping into adult life was not thrown off a cliff alone. They were caught by a dense web of experienced people who had done it all before. And notice what is completely missing from this system: retirement. There was no age where you clocked out and stopped mattering. The oldest members were the group's living library, the only place a lifetime of rare knowledge was stored before writing existed. Where was the water in the Great Drought 40 years ago? Which berry saved everyone during the bad winter? Which neighboring group could be trusted? An elder who could no longer run could still steer, and that made them priceless. In a world with no books, losing an old person meant losing an entire archive at once. Okay, so the body matures slowly, the group shares the load, but what actually flipped the switch from child to adult? because it was not a slow fade the way it is for you. For most of human history, it was a hard, ceremonial, unmistakable line. Rites of passage. A scholar named Arnold van Gennep, back in 1909, was the first to map out how these ceremonies work across cultures, and they follow a strikingly similar three-part shape. You are separated from the group. You go through an ordeal or a period apart. Then you return, transformed, with a new status that everyone instantly recognizes. Another anthropologist, Victor Turner, dug deep into that strange in-between phase, the moment when you are no longer a child but not yet an adult, hanging in what he called a liminal state. The point of these rituals was to make growing up an event, not a decade. One hunt, one ceremony, one ordeal, and the entire community now treats you as an adult. No ambiguity, no emerging adulthood, no 28-year-old still describing himself as figuring things out. You went in a child and walked out an adult, sometimes in a single day. And once you were an adult, the adult things followed quickly. Marriage, a role in the group, real responsibility. Because the society around you was built to move you into a productive slot as fast as possible. There simply was no cultural budget for a long, cushioned pause. A small group living on the edge could not afford to have its strong, capable young people sitting on the sidelines finding themselves for 10 years. Marriage in particular was rarely the modern fairy tale of two people chasing a feeling. For most of history, it was closer to a treaty. Families joined to lock in allies, share resources, blend skills, and keep the peace between groups. It was a practical, adult contract, an economic and social merger negotiated by the whole community, not a swipe on a screen. Affection could absolutely grow inside it later, but the starting point was strategy, not butterflies. Which, honestly, is one modern upgrade almost all of us are quietly glad we made. And the responsibilities that came with adulthood were not gentle. A teenage ancient adult might be trusted with calls that decided whether the group ate that week, whether a wound was cleaned right, whether the band moved camp before the cold set in. There was no manager to escalate to, no grown-up in the room, because they were the grown-up in the room. Compare that to the modern rite of passage of being handed the aux cord at a party and quietly panicking. The pressure they shouldered that young would flatten most of us in an afternoon. And yet they carried it, generation after generation, which is a big part of why any of us are here to feel behind on our own timelines at all. Which raises the obvious question, why us then? Why do we get the long, luxurious, extended childhood our ancestors could never dream of? The answer, in one word, is abundance. As food became reliable, as medicine crushed child mortality, as machines took over the labor that young hands used to do, the pressure vanished. Suddenly, a society could afford to keep its young people in school, out of the workforce, and protected for years and years. The long childhood stopped being a biological luxury the body wanted but the world would not allow, and finally became something a civilization could actually provide. Jeffrey Arnett's emerging adulthood. That whole messy decade of gap years, degrees, false starts, and figuring it out only exists because we got rich enough and safe enough to hand it out. It is not a sign that we are lazy or broken or worse than our tough ancestors. It is a sign of staggering, historically bizarre safety. And the numbers on this are wild. Across much of the world, the average age of a first marriage has climbed by roughly a decade compared to a century ago. First home, first steady job, first child, all sliding later and later. We invented the gap year, the quarter-life crisis, the unpaid internship, and the deeply modern ritual of moving back into your childhood bedroom at 26 to save on rent. An ancient elder watching you rebrand that as a bold financial strategy would be speechless. But every one of those delays rests on a foundation your ancestors would have treasured beyond words. Steady food, low danger, and the freedom to spend years simply becoming who you are. So let us put the whole thing back together. Biology gave humans the longest childhood of any animal because our brains needed the time. But for almost all of history, the brutal math of a high-risk world overrode that biology and shoved people into adult roles the moment their bodies could handle it, around 12 to 15, backed by grandmothers, alloparents, and hard ceremonial lines that flipped child to adult overnight. Then, only in the last century or so, abundance finally let biology have its way, and we handed childhood back the long, slow timeline it was always built for. Which means the strangest, most modern thing about you is not that you grew up too slowly. It is that you are one of the first humans in 300,000 years who was actually allowed to. So the next time you feel behind, still renting, still single, still not sure what you want to be when you grow up at the ripe old age of 33, remember this. Your ancestors would not see a failure. They would see something they never once got to experience. Time. The rarest luxury our species has ever known, and you are soaking in it. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to read the answers. At what age did you finally feel like a real adult? Or, be honest, are you still waiting for it to kick in? Tell me down in the comments. And if you made it this far, you just aged up a little, because now you understand something most grown-ups never do. Subscribe, and next time you will never look at an ordinary human life the same way again.